This is lecture 14b. So last time I talked about the Turks as this nomadic people coming out of Central Asia. Now I want to talk about the Mongols. The Mongols lived in North Central Asia, and they were nomadic just like the Turks were. And they had a long history of attacking or invading China, and there were various groups of tribes such as the Jurchen and the Uyghurs, etc., who were all these nomadic groups up in northern Asia and who were on the periphery of China. Well, the real key to the Mongols becoming a major player was the person Temujin. He was born probably 1162, although he might have been born a little earlier. Died in 1227. Temujin was the son of a fairly important tribal leader, but he was that tribal leader was poisoned and killed when Temujin was young, and he essentially, his family gets in the fallout of that, his family gets sort of cast out, and they actually wind up being sort of homeless for a while, and then he gets enslaved as a child, as a young adolescent, 12, 13, and he winds up escaping from slavery, and he winds up finally reconnecting with some relatives who are willing to help him out, and he becomes a sort of an important tribal leader. But then he really starts to show a real flair for the political, and he begins to not only become a tribal leader, but he has some very interesting ideas, which I'll talk about in a minute on innovations and organizations. And he essentially conquers, defeats, and forces to join him a bunch of other Mongol tribes and other nomadic tribes, such that by 1206 he has basically unified all of the Mongol tribes, which had not been done before. And they had at a conference or a meeting in 1206, he was named Chinggis or Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler or oceanic ruler. And so this was a recognition that he ruled all of the Mongols. And so by 1206, he was the ruler of all the Mongols. And I want to point out, he's like 44 by that point. And at this point, though, Genghis Khan did a number of things that were really interesting. First of all, usually in Mongol culture, if you're putting together a military force, you did it in terms of families and tribes and clans, which meant that you weren't. It didn't matter if somebody was particularly a good warrior. If they were the head of a big clan, they got an important position as a high-ranking officer, and so they sort of controlled their group, which made them an important officer. Genghis Khan did a totally different thing. He started to promote people based on ability. He said, if you really show yourself to be a great military leader, I'm going to put you in charge of people regardless of where you stand in your family or clan. And so he began to take a lot of people who were fairly minor, from minor families and clans, and who were fairly poor, and he began to elevate them. And he began to really organize the forces of the Mongols along what we would call military lines, with standard divisions and regiments and things like that, and standard lines of officers. And this was a real change, because before it was, people fought with their family as a clan. All the brothers and cousins and uncles and fathers would fight together, but now he's breaking people up. And this really makes for much better command structures, meaning he's better able to give orders to his officers and have them, have the officers enforce them, but it also gives him much more talented leadership, right? And so this is a really big innovation on Genghis Khan's part, and it has huge results, because he can take the sort of natural potential of the Mongols and other nomadic peoples, the horseback riding ability, the archery ability, etc., and he can harness that now through his organization and innovation to turn them into serious military forces. And not only that, but he now has the capability to put together larger and larger military forces, which is really important. So given that, and given the fact that Genghis Khan had such a hard life with slavery and being totally impoverished for a while, and then he was also betrayed personally by a number of people who were his allies and friends and then turned against him. And so he really had a sort of a suspicious streak But this made him a much more strategic thinker. He was constantly willing to innovate and to adopt things that he learned, such as when he conquered China, he learned about siege techniques from Chinese military figures, and he's like, oh, well, I'm adopting that, and he adopted gunpowder weapons from the Chinese. He was willing to adopt all sorts of things if he saw they were useful, and he was willing to really change his strategies and his tactics if he saw things that worked better. And this made him a really potent military organizer. Well, it's fairly late in life. 45 is pretty late. You know, life expectancy was not that long at that point. But at 45, Genghis Khan set out on a reign of conquest. That he basically began a series of conquests, and he realized as he was conquering things that his military was way superior to everybody else's, and so he just kept going and conquering more and more. He kept saying, well, there's nobody to stop me, I'm going to keep going. And so from 1207, for the last 20 years of his life, until 1227, he was basically just conquering things. And he built the biggest empire the world had ever seen. So he moves around a lot. I'm going to talk about this in terms of regions, but in fact he would attack China for a while, and then the next year the campaign was against central, the cities on the Silk Roads, and then the next year the campaign was back in China, and then it was down in Persia, and then it was up in Korea, and then it was over in Eastern Europe, etc. But I'm going to talk about these sort of regionally to make more sense of it. So beginning in 1207, well, 1208 I think it is, but there's a series of raids on northern China. Now, northern China at this point was under the Jin dynasty, which had taken northern China from the Song dynasty. We saw that in a previous lecture. So the Jurchen were nomadic peoples also. So he begins to attack the Jurchen, and he winds up knocking off the Jin dynasty. And then later he comes back and he begins to attack the Song dynasty. Now he wouldn't conquer the whole Song dynasty before he died, but his sons would finish conquering the Song dynasty within a few years of when he died. So he essentially conquers all of China by taking chunks of it at a time. And then he turns north and he attacks Korea and what we would today call Manchuria. And he conquers them. And then in separate regions, he began to attack big cities along the Silk Roads. Samarkand and Bukhara and these big cities that were major trade depots along the Silk Roads. And he began to conquer those one after another and to control the Silk Roads. And then he began to move down into Persia, and he's attacking the Abbasids now. Now the Mongols would eventually topple the Abbasids in the 1250s. That's well after Genghis Khan is dead. But I'll talk about that in a later lecture. And then he begins to move into Eastern Europe, into modern-day Ukraine and Russia and areas like that. And so he conquers everything in his path. I mean, it really is an amazing run that he has. He's almost unstoppable. And this is due to several things. One is, as I mentioned, he's got this fantastic military organization, which allows him to do maneuvers and plan strategies in a much more sophisticated way than his opponents, because he knows that he knows he can trust the officers, the generals he has, and he knows that they understand him. Second, he also, as I mentioned, the Mongols were just fantastic horsemen. And they had these really sturdy, fairly small horses that were really sturdy and could handle enormous hardship. And so they could actually ride enormously long distances on very little food. And this allowed, and the Mongols were simply, they could go so far so fast that their enemies were just shocked that how the heck did they get over there? How did that happen? Then also the Mongols had developed a short bow, a bow for shooting arrows, but they had a design for it that it was short, which meant it was easy to use on a horse. If you have a really long bow, you can't get it around to the other side of the horse, etc. They had a short bow that you could shoot, move around easily when you're riding the horse. But because of the strings on it, the Mongols had developed a certain way of making the strings for it. They were really very powerful for the size, and so they were fantastic weapons. And incidentally, just as a side note, the Mongols did try to invade northern India, They came down through the Khyber Pass into modern-day Pakistan and northern India. But they found that the intense humidity and heat in India actually made the strings on their bows get a little bit looser, and they found that their bows were not nearly as effective. They couldn't shoot as far. They didn't hit with as much power. And there were lots of other reasons, but that's one of the reasons the Mongols actually did not invade India, was that they found their bows were ineffective, and their bows were this enormous advantage that they just simply couldn't give up and still be an effective military force. But the next thing the Mongols did is they used gunpowder weapons. Now, they didn't have real cannons as we understand them today. They had things that were sort of like cannons, that weren't as powerful. They hadn't really figured out the physics of really powerful cannons yet. But the Mongols did adopt gunpowder weapons, and they did use them. And I want to just point out that real formidable gunpowder weapons would be developed in Europe and under the Ottoman Turks as the cannon in the mid-1300s. So this is after the Mongols. And that's where they really began to figure out how to cast these metal cannons that were strong enough and heavy enough that they could really handle the force of a serious charge of gunpowder without blowing up. And once they had that, then cannons became serious weapons. And that's the beginning of the gunpowder era. And that totally changes things. And in some sense, I want to make it clear, the Mongols and the Turks came out of, they appeared in history at this time when they got themselves organized, and they had a natural advantage in their horseback riding and archery skills. But with the advent of gunpowder in the 1300s, it really wouldn't have been possible for the Mongols to exist to be that successful after that. Because once you get into gunpowder armies, it totally changes the nature of military force, and armies become much more focused on not having people with skills, but rather having large numbers of people with guns. Because a whole bunch of semi-skilled people with guns can win a battle against a small number of really skilled people who don't have guns. All right? And so the Mongol and Turkish advantage of being fantastic horseback riders and archers sort of evaporates once you get into the gunpowder era. In any case, Genghis Khan then has this 20-year run of absolutely fantastic success, conquering China and Korea, conquering the Silk Roads, conquering into Persia, into Eastern Europe. And we'll see in the next part of the lecture that his sons would continue this success and even expand on it.